Have we got everyone in, Rory?
I think so. People will come in.
Okay, well, I'm sure people will drift in just as we get going. So welcome everyone to our May POGO session. We've got a fantastic panel today focusing on initiatives to increase citizen participation and to include small and medium-sized enterprises, voluntary organisations, women-owned businesses and minority groups in the government contracting process. So this is a really exciting topic, and we've got all kinds of experience from around the world to share. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing what our panel have got to say. As usual, the formal session is recorded. And if you're able to stay, some of our panelists will be staying after 5 o'clock for more of an informal chat without the recording on. Please do use the chat function in Zoom to share your questions and comments and thoughts as the presentations develop. And once we've heard from all our panelists, there will be the usual opportunity to ask a question. So please store up your questions for that moment, or put them in the chat and we'll try and pick them up later. So that's probably enough introduction from me. And we'll start with our first speaker, Dr. Marie-Julie Chenard. MJ.
Thank you for the opportunity to present today to you, Anne and Rory, as well. If you'd be happy to bring up the slides, unless, excellent, thank you. So to add to a brief introduction and blurb sent around earlier, DCMS is the government lead for policy in relation to charities and social enterprises, also known as Voluntary, Community and Social Enterprises, or VCSEs. That's the acronym that I'm going to use throughout my presentation. Government cares about this group for a number of reasons and their participation. So to begin with, we acknowledge that in order to solve complex social problems and meet especially the complex needs of vulnerable groups, government doesn't have all the answers, nor the resources, nor the reach. And it is charities and social enterprises, these VCSEs, who have the expertise and connection to local areas, which means that they're ideally placed to help create more responsive, efficient, and trusted public services. And their services, as a result, can achieve greater impact, especially for those most vulnerable groups who are hard for the traditional public sector to reach. And this is then as well reflected by the fact that over 70% of civil society organizations, they deliver public services where they're based. And another reason why government cares is that charities and social enterprises, they can make the economy more productive, resilient, and innovative. So civil society, we know as a whole, contributes around 17 billion towards UK gross value add, and it employs around 1 million people around the UK. So we want the sector to be sustainable and resilient, and one policy lever we have to help with the sector's income diversification is public procurement. And in the UK, that's 300 billion per year. So to round up the introduction, really, since 2012, government has introduced a whole range of interventions to increase VCSE participation in public procurement, notably the Social Value Act, the Procurement Policy Notice 620, known as the social value model, and there's also the whole series of work by the Crown Representative for the sector, Claire Dove. For the purpose of this session, I'll talk about what DCMS have done, so my department, over the last 2.5 years, And I'll focus on the VCSE contract readiness program and how we are plugging this sector capability building measure into other policy initiatives like departmental action plans so that we can achieve a whole system change. I'll cover in my presentation first policy analysis, then policy design, and then third policy delivery, including the evaluation, which speaks to the question about how we measure everything. So in terms of the policy analysis, what is the problem then with VCSE participation? Our research has shown that there are up to 250,000 active VCSEs in the UK, and we estimate that between 9,200 and 12,500 engage in government contract each year. So despite this value that VCSEs bring to public services, they only account for around 5% of government spend in this area. Now, what are the causes of this problem and how can we target our policy to actually make a difference? And how can we as well get buy-in from key sector stakeholders to make any solution work? And to answer that, we commissioned some independent research into the barriers and growth potential. And as a result, the key issues we identified that our department could tackle with most impact were on the supply side, so related to charities and social enterprises, capability to bid, access to information on contract opportunities, whilst on the demand side, so related here specifically to central government, awareness and understanding of this sector, what do they have to offer, and why engaging particularly with them, as well as another barrier is has been capacity to engage with these organizations. Then to the question on how to target efforts, the focus are on larger VCSEs, and the reason for this is because they're more likely to have the capacity to scale up public contracting activity. So that's above a turnover of 100K per year. And we'd focus as well on those public services where better outcomes for beneficiaries require really the ability to handle complex issues relating to health and social care, employability, or disability issues. So now, and that's the next slide, which is coming on to the solution. We created a 3-year, £900,000 contract readiness fund, and we ran a competition to find sector delivery partners for a program of work. The winners are a consortium led by the School for Social Entrepreneurs, and they're working with Social Enterprise UK and Voice for Change. And what they've done is taking the outcomes, the barriers that we wanted to tackle, and designed a program divided into mainly 2 pathways. One that targets VCSEs, and that's where most funding goes. It's offering fully funded training courses tailored to the different needs of VCSEs, depending on where they are in their journey with government contracting. The other targets public sector commissioners, and this one speaks to the question as well about measurement. Here, our offer to government departments includes to baseline departmental spend with VCSEs, so that departments can better understand how much they're spending with this group and how they can do more. The whole program then is underpinned by an online public services hub, which aims to publicly centralize and communicate existing resources and guidance. So that's about what we think the solution is. And the next slide, moving on to delivery, including evaluation. So whilst we have the contract readiness program on the demand side, what we're doing with it is plugging it, especially the commissioner pathway, through a cross-government task force, which our VCSE grant representative chairs. And invited departments are those that lead on the public services we have identified as being VCSE rich. So including the Department for Health and Social Care, the Department for Work and Pension, the Ministry of Justice. And not least, it is as part of this task force that DCMS published their action plan. And this is to demonstrate our commitment to increase VCSE participation. And with the intention, well, this being the first bespoke one in central government, it's really intended as a trailblazer, as really showing or leading the example on what is possible, and as well to build on in future iterations, to really demonstrate the distance traveled. So that is then how we're looking to plug especially the commissioner pathway into existing work across government. Now, the question is about whether it's working, and to help answer this, from the start, we baked data collection into our contract readiness program. And we've just selected an external evaluator to do both a process as well as an impact evaluation. And the intention is that we'll have a mid-program evaluation to assist us in continuously improving what we're rolling out. So that leads me to conclusions. We have the Contract Readiness Fund that reflects the government's broader efforts to reduce barriers to VCSE participation in public services. And the intention behind DCMS creating this program, as well as trailblazing with the action plan, is to make it easy and attractive for other government departments to change and improve how they work together with charities and social enterprises. So the contract readiness program, coupled with demand-side initiatives, aim for system change, enabling both suppliers in the VCSE sector and public sector commissioners to work together to deliver better public services. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for that. And next up, we have Camila. Over to you. Camila, is there a problem with your sound? We can't hear you. I thought it was maybe just me, but the chat is suggesting that it's not just me.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, perfect. Then I guess my headphones, so sorry.
Sorry.
No worries. So as I was saying, so my name is Camila Salazar, and I am the head of data analytics and learning at the Open Contracting Partnership. For those who don't know us, OCP is a non-for-profit that works in over 50 countries, including the UK. And what we do is that we help partners, including government, civil society, and the private sector, to think different about public procurement and to do that using an open government and an open data approach to drive reforms. And we focus on procurement because it's the world's biggest marketplace, and we want to ensure, and we believe that governments need to ensure to spend efficiently and effective equitable public spending. So part of the work that we do is that we collect evidence and practical examples on how public procurement could leave could lead to measurable outcomes. And one of these efforts is a research report that we developed that was published last year, where we supported research in 12 countries to investigate topics related to equity and effectiveness in public procurement. And part of some of those research projects focuses specifically on assessing how could the government increase opportunities for SMEs and women businesses in public procurement. So I'm just going to give like a high-level overview of some of the findings and the recommendations of that report, and I'll be sharing those links in the chat so that you can dive deeper into the specific country reports. But part of the challenges, which I think were mentioned also like in the previous presentation, is that even if the context was different across countries and governments, there was the technical nature of the procurement process, the complexity in the different regulatory frameworks and excessive requirements were one of the main challenges faced by SMEs. And this reflected in not only the technical challenges in the process itself, but a key challenges that some agencies that the enterprises face was that the government publishes information in a disaggregated way. So SMEs didn't have the opportunity to see like the big picture of opportunities, and it was really difficult for them to identify business opportunities. So there was a defragmentation of opportunities. Other challenges, ones that has been widely researched, was related to late payments, of course, in government, which prevented these enterprises to participate in the process. And in addition, there were some strategies. The government had the certification processes. So for instance, to make contracts suitable for SMEs, for women-owned, but the companies needed to have a certification in order to participate in these opportunities. And the problem was that a lot of these companies weren't aware of the certification process, and the process was complex in itself. So that was a barrier as well that the researchers found. Also, in other contexts, even when there were strategies in place to increase and promote the registration of these types of companies, they identified that this was just the first step. And then the main challenge was that once they registered in the system, there was in some countries, half of the registered companies had never submitted a bid. So there was a barrier for initial participation in the market that was preventing these companies from participating. And another area that, so at OCP, we really try to focus on helping governments, how can you improve the policies of your procurement process, but also this need to be alongside how do we have better data to track those policies. So one of the key challenges that the researchers found was that there was a lack of data to track the implementation of these policies and its implementation. So even in countries that have had these policies to promote SMEs, to promote the participation of minority groups in procurement, there was a lack of data that limited even setting baselines for these policies and tracking how the program or the policies were going. This had to do with, in a lot of cases, this information is not even in a digital format. So you might have these forms to register companies, but this is not incorporated into that procurement system itself. So it was really hard in some cases to even track that information, and it was disaggregated. So for instance, in the UK, like the data publication includes if there's a contract suitable for, as we were seeing before, for VCSEs, but then there might be a lack of information to identify if a company is an SME or minority owned in the data publication. So those were sort of some of the challenges. Jump into recommendations, and I'm just going to give a quick overview. Some of the recommendations that they addressed was the need to standardize tender specification documents, and this could be disaggregated by the different types of contracts and tender opportunities. But also they found that it was key to socialize and collaborate with the private sector. So socialize these documents before their approval to guarantee that they are understandable for potential suppliers. This relates as well to having programs that create capacity building programs for vendors, and implement outreach strategies so that it is important to reach potential suppliers and foster an environment of collaboration with the private sector itself. Also policies to promote and simplify the registration process for SMEs in public procurement. And a key thing, what I was saying about publishing disaggregated contracting data in open formats that allows you to calculate baselines and to identify those opportunities for the private sector. At OCP, we have a lot of guidance on how to do this. We have examples of countries and local governments who have implemented this. So if any of you is interested in that, we're happy to share more information on that. And also, I think, as I was saying, the idea is for you to dive deep into the report and see specific examples. I think one of the reports that might be interesting for a lot of you is one qualitative framework that was developed as part of this research initiative by Oxford Insights. That is a framework that allows you to assess gender equality and social inclusion in public procurement. So it allows you to identify your policies, regulations, and laws within your government agency or country. So hopefully this will be a useful resource. And I'm going to stop there. And as I said, I'll be sharing all these links of the reports in the chat, and happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed for that presentation. Next to have the floor is Issel. Over to you.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? We're good? Great. Thank you so much. I'm Issel Masses. I'm Executive Director and founder of Sembrando Sentido. We are an organization that works to develop knowledge and tools so that we can collectively transform our government structures and achieve fair and equitable use of public resources in Puerto Rico. The organization was born amidst this dichotomy where we are receiving over $127 billion in the reconstruction, post-disaster reconstruction process of Puerto Rico and its islands. And yet we are seeing growing inequality, growing gentrification, weakened systems, and growing corruption and mismanagement. And there's a very big missing piece here that's called accountability and ensuring that communities are at the center. And this trend, we can talk about the colonial structures and how they've disenfranchised our communities from actually ensuring that they have a voice and they're at the center of the equation. But that's essentially where and why Sembrando was built. We really work to ensure that there's civic disruption, but we recognize that in order to engage our civil society, we need to understand what's happening. And in order to understand, we need data and we need information, and we need to drill down on the critical systemic weaknesses that we see in our governance structures of today. And so that's essentially what Sembrando does. When we started our work as a new organization, we needed to choose a priority area. And that was a fairly easy decision to make. At the time, over 50% of the government's budget was and continues to be spent in public contracting and public procurement practices to provide essential services from energy to transportation, and it's where the market and the government come into contact. In the case of Puerto Rico, it's oftentimes done behind closed doors, which, as we all know, can lead to misaligned incentives. And it's one of the biggest risks of corruption in, globally speaking, but also when we refer to our context in particular. This means that Puerto Rico could be losing up to $3.1 billion a year because of weaknesses in procurement and contracting. And this is equivalent to 12% of our annual budget, to give you a sense of what we're talking about. And so what we focused on is starting to build knowledge. When we started, we identified over 56 government portals that had some sort of data that was decentralized, low quality, incomplete, all of the typical challenges that we often see in data sites, unfortunately. But we also saw that we didn't have rigorous research around policy and systemic weaknesses regarding public spending, much less public contracting. And so our decision was to create that baseline, really make sense out of the information that was out there so that we could start exchanging and sharing that information with civil society, with the private sector, and that we could actually increase engagement in this area and transform the system to something that is more inclusive and equitable. Our biggest solution in regards to our project on contracting is called Contracts by the Book, or Contratos en Ley in Spanish. And it's the first platform that opens, monitors, and evaluates public contracting in Puerto Rico. It has 3 key components to it: the search engine, which has increased the transparency and accessibility of contracting information by over 350% at this time, and it will hopefully get to 600 by the end of the year. Here, we also monitor and raise red flags of potential corruption or mismanagement risks with the help of open contracting as well. And we also evaluate public policy, right? And we've done that in regards to the overall system, but also in regards to reconstruction. And one example of that is actually our work alongside Open Contracting Partnership, where we've observed, like many other organizations in Puerto Rico, that years and years passed and the reconstruction money just isn't spent, or it's spent, but the results are not seen. And we still have over 80% of the households in needs to be addressed. And when we talk about household needs, we talk about basic repairs like having a roof over your head that have yet to be reconstructed and rebuilt and fixed. And so what we did alongside with open contracting was to assess whether transparency, efficiency, or equity challenges were actually preventing or delaying or affecting the reconstruction process. And to no surprise here, the answer to all 3 of them were yeses, big yeses. First and most importantly, the lack of transparency, the decentralization of information being disclosed, as incomplete as it was, just made it worse. We were talking about dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of web pages, of newspapers, of Facebook sites where information on contracting was being shared, or pieces of that information shared. And it ultimately prevented the government from monitoring itself, because there's no central space or open data sites where they can actually analyze how things are going and where there are opportunities for improvements. The private sector could also had big challenges, especially the small local sector in Puerto Rico, because it would only find out either after the opportunity deadline passed or very close and near that deadline opportunity, and they wouldn't be able to prepare a good proposal for an actual competitive bid. And it also affected civil society, who could not actually engage, but because it did not understand what was and what continues to go on in regards to reconstruction spending. When we look at the efficiency of contracting, we also saw, to give you a very quick sense, that over 10% of the bids were being canceled because they didn't have enough bidders to consider the actual bid as competitive. And it took more than 9 months for proposals of an RFP to be evaluated, right? And if an RFQ preceded the RFP, it would entail a 1.5 years before that evaluation of proposals led somewhere else in terms of decision making. And so obviously this showcases the lack of transparency and its impact in terms of efficiency. And when we look at equity, the story is also not any better. 5 years after Hurricane Maria hit, we're still seeing large inequity problems at the contracting and subcontracting levels, where over 63% of the funding that goes to contract goes to US big mainland corporations, instead of presenting itself for good opportunities of growth at the local level. So, as Camila mentioned, we don't just raise the issues, we look at good solutions, good practices, and how we can make progress on this front. And so one of our biggest calls to action, no surprise here, is that we need to centralize information in one place, and we need to do it in open data formats that allow for systemic analyzing and also engagement and engagement from the private sector and from civil society as well. We use all the information that we develop and we make it as accessible as possible for the local sector to be better engaged and to have these conversations and to inform their advocacy efforts. And I will also add that we do the same with communities. We work heavily with communities, especially the most marginalized and vulnerable communities, to ensure that they have the information they need to inform their advocacy strategies. There are billions, again, billions and billions of dollars worth of decision making that will impact their lives, whether it's socially, economically, or environmentally speaking. And they have the right to also be involved in these processes, but they need to understand it. And so thanks to open contracting and the work that we've been able to do, we've been able to create the baseline that actually helps level the playing field in terms of inclusion and conversations around contracting spending and impact. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed for that. And we'll move straight on to our next panelist, who is Mary.
Thanks very much, Anne. I am Mary Mitchell. I work for Shared Service in Public Procurement in Scotland. Scotland Excel is the name of the organisation. And I'm here to talk about, I suppose, a piece of work that is essentially an interface between that citizen participation, the third sector, and public procurement. And Rory's kind of roped me into this through a workshop that I attended earlier on this year, which was part of that sharing of good practice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of micro conditions that this grew up within. I worked previously, before I worked for Scotland Excel, in a local authority in Scotland. And we had observed an emerging problem in how we worked in this area. When the community benefits obligations in the Procurement Reform Act kind of came into being, we'd already been seeking community benefits in our public procurement. And as that kind of momentum built, we were getting more and more offers of benefit to the community, but we're increasingly seeing that it was difficult to evidence that those had been delivered. There were difficulties in getting the community itself, the contractor, and actually the council and the council officers to have good insight to what was available through these contracts and mechanisms to facilitate delivery. So that was the problem we were trying to solve. And in doing that, we kind of kicked it around within the organisation to a fairly significant extent. We took our time, which is kind of unusual sometimes in public procurement, but we took our time to engage, to ask the community, you know, what they thought about the public procurement and the opportunities here, and to understand where the contractors were frustrated, because they were making good offers in their tenders, but were knowing by the end of that contract period, they weren't always getting the opportunity to deliver those. So what we came up with in our sort of problem solving was to flip the driver for community benefit from a push to a pull. So essentially we were asking contractors and then trying to push it out into the community. And we flipped that to a pull mechanism where the community requested the benefit. And we created what is now known as the community benefit wish list in this particular council area. We had a look online at the time, and the only other places we could find wish lists at that time were in a couple of organisations in Australia and actually one in Washington State, Rory, which were cat and dog homes and children's charities. So we think this might be the first in public procurement as far as we can tell. So the wish list itself, we developed by inviting community groups to register an interest, if you like, something that they were looking for. We set up categories: improving skills, improving employability, improving education, which would be liaison with schools, for example, job creation, which was very typical in community benefits and perhaps doesn't fit so well with the wish list model, but still has a place there. Donations of material and labour, time, advice, volunteering all came up in there, and sponsorship. And those are all established now in certainly the wish list that I was involved in some time ago. There's moderation in terms of working with the community groups to understand what they do in the community, what outcomes that they're there to achieve, that they are actually a bona fide community group, and to understand essentially how that will feed through into benefit outcomes that align well with the council. promotion of this new approach to the third sector, we brought in some specialist support on that, so that the procurement team wasn't the kind of driver for asking community groups. We put that out to a third sector specialist consultancy group, so that those were identified, and the promotion and the kind of a little bit of training around how to access the online forms that the council produced for this. That was quite a small piece of work. That council spends about 150 to 180 million pounds a year, so not a massive impact internationally. However, there was promotion of that wish list through a couple of mechanisms. The organisation I currently work for, as I said, is a shared service across the whole of Scotland's local authority community. We showcased it at a conference. It was then nominated for a GO Award, which is a local kind of recognition of procurement excellence in Scotland and in the UK. It won the category for social value in Scotland, and then went on to be highly commended in the UK award. So that, you know, created a bit of interest around it. We've now got the situation where about a third of the councils in Scotland are using a version of this. And in that kind of shared service space, we as Scotland Excel are looking at, in the big national frameworks we're creating to provide solutions for local government, how can we tap into that citizen participation in what is needed in my community with the contractor piece, and how do we involve as many charitable bodies in our public procurement work as possible, ensuring that we deliver outcomes that are well aligned to what we've stated in our public procurement strategy. And those of you that were on the call last month would have heard from Nikki Archer, who talked about the national strategy in Scotland, and the objectives of that strategy are to be good for business and employees. So this wish list sits very closely with that businesses are able to offer as part of their corporate social responsibility something meaningful that's really targeted to what communities are looking for. Good for society in itself, that's citizen participation in defining what we get from public procurement. Good for places and communities, the outcomes that are achieved through public procurement in those councils using wish lists is much easier to link back to the objectives for that area. And the fourth bit in the Scottish National Procurement Strategy is being open and connected. And that wish list that I cited initially is promoted through the council's website. There's an online form for community groups to submit, and it's mapped. So both contractors and communities can look at where they're being delivered, where community benefits are being requested, etc. So that use of technology has helped make this much more effective and much more visible. And that's really all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mary. And so last but not least, Catherine, the floor is yours.
Hi everyone, my name's Catherine and I'm a research fellow at the University of Oxford and University of Edinburgh. So many thanks for inviting me to speak today. I'd like to talk about my research projects, which I hope you'll find interesting and help aid today's discussion. So I'm working on two research projects. One of my projects is investigating finance and public procurement for net zero, and the other is investigating the governance of SMEs for net zero, and both of these are funded by the UK's Energy Research Centre. So whilst they are different projects, there are some key overlaps between them that I think would be useful to share. By way of introduction, we are all aware of the need to shift to a net zero society, and the role of public procurement is vital in this, since the UK, for example, spends about 1/3 of all public expenditure on public procurement each year, which is approximately £300 billion per annum. All levels of UK government are under pressure to act directly on climate change. And particularly within recent years, there have been cuts to local authority budgets, and in light of declarations on climate emergencies, local authorities are keen to deliver decarbonisation measures, and Mary has already touched upon this. There have been changes in public procurement law to incorporate sustainability policies when reviewing tenders for major contracts. In-scope organisations, such as central government departments, executive agencies or non-departmental bodies bidding for contracts more than 5 million must commit to reaching net zero by 2050 by way of a carbon reduction plan. There have been certain critiques of whether this is enough to reach net zero, but broadly, it's a step in the right direction because it does confirm bidders' commitments to achieving net zero. For example, bidders must set out the environmental management measures in effect, including certification schemes or specific carbon reduction measures that will apply when they are performing the contract, and they must also set out the bidder's baseline emissions footprint. SMEs represent approximately 90% of businesses and more than 50% of employment worldwide, and so they're an important contributor to job creation and global economic development. In the UK, there are approximately 5.5 million SMEs, which is about 99.9% of the business population, and they are diverse and wide-ranging across many different sectors. So many SMEs, therefore, will be potential bidders for public contracts. And all of us today clearly recognise how important it is that we look at SMEs more closely when we're talking about public procurement. So with regards to net zero, SMEs collectively are significant users of energy, whereby they consume more than 13% of total global energy and account for more than half the energy in the industrial and commercial sectors in some countries, including the UK. In our research, there has been a strong concern from SMEs themselves and organisations representing SMEs of the need to comply with environmental reporting requirements. However, there are broad challenges surrounding this. SMEs are considered to be collectively different from larger organisations beyond simply their size, and our research has shown that, first, there is a vast difference among SMEs in their commitments to climate change and their awareness of their own environmental management. On the one hand, some SMEs might be very knowledgeable about their carbon footprint and emissions and very committed to reduction targets, whereas others might not even know where to begin for finding out this information. Secondly, individual beliefs and values are particularly important in SMEs where management functions are concentrated on one single or very few individuals. So what this means is that organisational cultures may be dominated by the owner-manager, and therefore environmental decision-making amongst SMEs is very variable. Thirdly, SMEs have particularly limited resources and access to time, skills, and knowledge, so there is a barrier for them to be on an equal level playing field to others whilst undergoing the tendering process. And again, this poses questions for participation and inclusion. Some research has shown that it's particularly difficult to engage with SMEs on climate change alone, and there is a distinct lack of data surrounding SMEs and their energy usage. In terms of making sustainability and energy efficiency policy, the majority of policy either covers organisation of all size or it focuses on larger organisations, but there isn't much targeted at SMEs specifically. It can be argued, therefore, that this lack of policy focus on SMEs leads to low expectations of energy and carbon savings from that sector. But where does this leave us then for public procurement and SMEs for net zero? Well, I'd like to give an example of a local authority that is specifically securing net zero investment into local low carbon projects. And this is Bristol City Council, which is entering into a joint venture partnership that will bring in over 1 billion of investment to help make Bristol carbon neutral and climate resilient by 2030. So this project, which is named Bristol City Leap, will seek to invest a range of large infrastructure projects to reduce Bristol's carbon footprint by 140,000 tonnes. Notably, as part of this project's initial business plan, the City Leap Energy Partnership states that it is committed to delivering £61 million of social value over its first 5 years. It states that the majority of this is expected to be achieved through ensuring that over 50 million is spent with the local supply chain, including over 7 million with the micro, small and medium enterprise sector. So, large-scale net zero public procurement projects like Bristol City Leap are a potentially fruitful way for increasing participation of SMEs in net zero public procurement. But of course, the success of this is yet to be seen. That's it from me, but I'm very happy to be contacted further if you'd like to hear more about our projects. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, and well done to our panelists for being so interesting and also keeping very effectively to time. So we've got a few minutes for people to ask questions. I see there's been a lot going on in the chat, and I've asked our panelists to keep an eye on the chat so that they can respond to some of those comments and questions later on. But would anybody like to ask a question for them to address? Jamie, I see your little yellow hand.
My little yellow hand, can you hear me as well?
Yes.
Great, okay, and thank you very much to all the presenters, and thank you, Rory, for inviting me to this, by the way. This is the first one I've had the ability to attend. All the presentations were interesting. I had a question for Marie from DCMS, the first presenter. And I hope this isn't too challenging a question, but I'm always interested in trade-offs and I'm interested in opportunity cost. To introduce myself briefly, I'm both a researcher at the University of Nottingham and a commercial manager for National Savings and Investments, a weird little central government agency. You imply that voluntary and community sector organisations, VCSEs, sorry, voluntary community social enterprises, are not currently achieving a fair share of public contract spend. That circa 5% you identified as being a problem. So that implies that you want that percentage to go up. You want VCSEs collectively to win more. That implies that if your policy interventions are successful, some suppliers will win less public sector trade in future because it still has to add up to 100. So if that 5 goes up, someone else's percentage has gone down. Are there any particular organisations that DCMS in terms of policy therefore thinks are currently winning too much public sector business? Are we seeking to divert spend away from large private sector firms? Effectively, where will that increased VCSE success come from? Because that implies that some of that spend won't be going wherever it's going today.
It's a great question. MJ has a bit of time to think about it while we pick up a couple of other questions. Malcolm, I see you've got a hand raised, but you're muted. Malcolm, we can't hear you.
Apologies for the delay, yes.
There you are.
I was particularly interested in Catherine's presentation about what she's doing on the net zero challenge. The broader point I wanted to make is, from my perspective, I should say, first of all, Malcolm Harbour, I'm an associate of the Connected Places Catapult, and we've been doing a lot of work focused on local authorities about getting them to use public procurement in a more focused, strategic and innovative way. And I think everything that's been talked about comes into that category, actually. And my first plea is that I do think that part of the issue we have in the UK is we don't have a terribly integrated policy. Certainly the Social Value Act has been valuable, but it's been rather disconnected from the overall work on public procurement. I think the new rules will bring that together, but I'd just be interested to get a perspective on that. But specifically on net zero, I think that local authorities have a really important role to play here. And it's encouraging. Bristol, we know about, but we are working with other authorities, particularly for looking for, one is for sources of finance and longer term and maybe non-government subventions, but other ways of financing zero carbon projects. And secondly, to build up that capability within local authorities to be able to handle that. I think Catherine's point was very important about this. And the Cabinet Office is about to roll out a big training program, and I think we need to make sure that some of the issues that are already coming to the fore about using procurement in a strategic way to tackle net zero and other societal issues is properly reflected in the way that the new legislation is rolled out.
Fantastic, thank you. And then Richard, you get the last question. If you could keep it brief, that would be appreciated.
That's a tough ask for me, Anne. And may I thank Marco for what I was actually responding to the earlier question about SMEs and supply chains. I noticed in the chat there's a lot of chat about sort of big companies, small companies, big frameworks, and various approaches. I mean, the point is our supply chains are what they are. So they're a mixture of large companies and small providers. And one of the perverse issues we found is sometimes if you're favoring SMEs, and you award to SMEs as preference, you could actually be harming the local supply chain in that just because it's a large company headquartered out of the region doesn't mean that the provision isn't actually being made by SMEs that are contracted to that prime contractor. So you could actually find that a lot of local resource is disadvantaged because you're favoring an SME just a little bit further away. So this is about supply management and supply chain management, and my view is it's important to have visibility of the entire chain, not just the bit that you're particularly dealing with on that particular contract. So it really does need an open view. It needs careful assessment of local impact, and it needs processes that are inclusive. And one of the things I took from the background, thank you for the background material, but in that background reading, I saw that there were some common themes coming out of all of the guidance, and it was basically about simplify, engage, and just make things possible for people to engage and participate. Just one final thing before I sign off. It's as a procurement network. I mean, sometimes the difficulty for us is actually getting people to engage at all. And we have things called supply voids where we don't get responses. So in fact, encouraging markets is very much something that procurement officers would want to be doing. So it isn't simply about slamming doors and keeping people out. It's very much the opposite of that. We want people in, we want people participating, and we want people doing what it is that they do well. So thank you.
Thank you very much for your input, and thank you everyone for the comments and questions in the chat too. So what we'll do now, as we always do, is go back through our panelists and give them a couple of minutes each just for some very brief and rapid reactions to some of what they've heard. MJ, you're up first.
Thank you, Jamie, for the challenge. It is one that we are grappling with. And actually it speaks to a key question on evidence that we continue to have, which is about the unique value add of this sector. So making the case for procuring for charity from charities and social enterprises. So what's the comparative advantage of working with this sector as opposed to other providers? Or even doing it in-house, those public services that we're interested in. So if there is some kind of longitudinal approach or as well a comparative one, then certainly that's a whole research area we'd be keen to tap into. Now, in terms of responding as well, perhaps more directly to the question, the intention between these capability building efforts and the commitment in the action plans is to enable those organizations to compete alongside other providers, so that element of competition will still be there, and any of the assessments and the selection will still be there as well. So the intention of the policies are really leveling the playing field. That's where we're coming in from.
Fantastic, thank you. Camilla, any thoughts?
No, I guess I just want to highlight, I saw some comments in the chat related to other examples. So I just wanted to highlight that I shared the different links of the different strategies and country reports. A lot of what we do is collecting evidence of what worked and doesn't work depending on the context. So in the qualitative framework I shared, I also shared a link of a quantitative framework. There are companies that develop also by Oxford Insights. So I think those are relevant resources where you can think of strategies that might work and that might apply to your context. And we're of course happy to provide more guidance as needed. And I'll leave my contact details in the chat as well. So thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Camilla, and thank you for the resources. Issel, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, so I also shared most of the key critical links to the report and other work that we've done related to contracting. In terms of the equity question, I think that's a very valid points and questions related to the equity equation. I will say that our research actually analyzed subcontractors as well and saw the same distribution. And we also analyzed the backgrounds and the histories of a lot of the main contractors in the case of Puerto Rico's reconstruction. And we can say, unfortunately, that the story looks worse the more that you actually analyze these contractors. Some of the top contractors at the local level right now for reconstruction are also contractors that have had to pay over $100 million in fraud claims at the federal level. Some of them have been canceled contracts in the US in reconstruction of other states in the US because of non-compliance. And some of these corporations were also new, like the case of Whitefish, which is one of the most renowned and famous cases in terms of Puerto Rico reconstruction. Typical US company that was registered a year before being hired with 2 employees and hundreds and millions in contracting for reconstruction. And so unfortunately, I cannot say that the story looks a lot better as you look further into it, but rather it raises more questions on really how we're going about it. And in terms of the competitiveness and trying to make sure that you get as many bidders, eligible bidders as possible, we also don't see a lot of progress there. Things like and instruments like RFIs are never used to really solidify and help develop a bid that makes sense and that it has the right requirements. Open conversations with the private sector, but in an open space are also not commonly used. And so this really limits the ability of the government to actually develop bids, especially in areas where they might not have the expertise that actually have the right requirements to attract the right bidders. So I'll stop here. Like I said, I've already shared some of the links, and I'll share the contact information. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you. Mary, any concluding thoughts from you or responses?
More an observation than and certainly a concluding thought that it's complex, this achieving social value from public procurement, and that will not be news to anyone on this call. But we do have lots of levers at our disposal. You know, everything we've heard today has been, you know, in some way a mechanism that helps contribute to that achievement of social value. And I think for me as a procurement professional working in this space, it's about the context, as somebody said a moment ago, that if we're looking at what can this particular procurement exercise achieve, we can tailor the procurement work relating to that particular exercise in order to optimize the benefits that it delivers locally or nationally, or whatever our context is. But I do believe that that's only useful if we have some mechanism for measuring and evidencing what that has achieved, and being able to sort of recycle that back into the conversation and learn from it. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And finally, Catherine.
Hi there. Yeah, so just to kind of follow up on what Mary was saying, I don't really have any specific points, but I guess when we're talking about public procurement and net zero, it really is important to kind of look at how this is all kind of combined to help achieve environmental and social priorities and challenges as well. And just to answer very briefly Malcolm's question, and he raised a really valid point about the Social Value Act and that kind of all bringing it in together. Local authorities do have a really important role in this kind of process for innovative financing, and I'm really happy to pick up that discussion separate from the call. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you. So finishing dead on 5 o'clock. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for a great session today. Lots of interesting points, lots of themes across very different contexts and jurisdictions. So that was lovely to see. Thanks for everyone who participated in the chat or in the questions. And thank you for all the discussion that's gone on there. So well done, everyone, for, as someone's just said, getting through a huge amount of content in that time. So thank you very much. Rory, have you got any final announcements you need to give?
I can say thanks and remind everybody that there's a social outcomes conference that's happening in September. Just sharing the link there. It's from the Government Outcomes Lab. And in advance of that conference, we are scoping up a seminar that's focused directly on net zero targets in outcomes-based contracting. And yeah, thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you again next time. Please stay around for the informal chat if you have time.